Let's talk about in this video why most of the time you will end up doing something that you will probably never realize. And let's be very specific here. If you want to be a financial banker, I'll tell you that most likely you won't end up being a financial banker, for example. Or if you want to be an accountant or sales executive, or if you want to become an actor or a footballer, you most likely won't end up doing this job. And the first reason is because of statistical probability, right? So let's talk about this for a moment. A lot of people are not realistic about their future, and it's mainly because that the maths, the logical maths, just doesn't add up. If you, for example, look at a specific industry, like let's say a professional footballer or an artist or an actor, the chances of you becoming or ending up in that role is literally less than 1%. It's less than 1%, so 0.01%. And so I'm not saying it's impossible. It is possible. You see people that end up doing the job, you know, that they have done since when they were a child, or the job that they always dreamed of. And obviously that 0.01% varies through, throughout the industry or throughout the specific occupation. But I assume that because you're watching this YouTube video, you're probably like aiming for the stars, the northern lights. You want to end up in your dream job, the greatest job that you can ever think of. And again, like theoretically speaking, there's nothing wrong with that. But one angle of the statistical probability will probably say that you won't, right? And so I can give you a very specific example. Like if you look at specific industries where you have lawyers or doctors, you can make a very generic and basic survey and just ask them like how many of them actually end up doing the job that they studied. And the statistic is crazy. And by the way, it's a statistic that universities don't want to show, because for some reason it will probably like decrease the amount of intakes per semester for students. But the point is, you can have a general survey and you might even know people who end up doing a job that they have never studied or never essentially prepared themselves for. And so that is a very specific example. But let's not talk about the logical things or about statistic or maths or real world examples. Let's talk about something more holistic, something more perhaps realistic for you, and something that will make sense by the end of this video, right? And say, let's make a very specific example, right? Your goal is to become, let's just make it a CEO of a company. CEO of a company. Right? Although that is a little bit vague. Let's just make it, okay, you know what? I'll give you guys a very specific example. Let's say your dream job for some reason is to be a pilot, right? I'm sure if you have Asian parents, you've probably heard about this before, but let's make this a very specific example, right? You want to be a pilot, right? And so this is you, right? And there are many reasons for why, you want to be a pilot. And for the most case, it's probably from conditional learning, right? Conditional learning. And so in other words, your surrounding has influenced you, conditional learning. Your surroundings has influenced you in such a way that you are basically programmed, and your brain is somehow or somewhat hardwired for you to believe that being a pilot is, your sole objective. And for most people, that's, usually the case. Very often, like, your parents would dictate the type of life you want to, especially like traditional family structures. You see that very often. And I'm not trying to undermine this or anything. In fact, I believe to some extent it works quite well, especially if the parents, align you to an occupation that makes sense and is, relevant to your specific personality or your specific skills and qualifications. But the issue with this statement is that very often they don't really understand that it's actually about you, right? And it's mainly about what they want, like what your parents want, what society wants, what, I don't know, your girlfriend wants or your friends want. And so a lot of people along this journey, when they actually, I don't know, for example, go through the pilot academy, get their test flights, a lot of the people learn throughout the way that it's something that they actually don't want to do or don't want to be, right? And so I'll tell you why that's usually the case. And number one is mentioned what I tried to kind of explain earlier with your preconditional learning. And it's basically at a very early age, you basically get this, idea of, okay, you want to be a pilot because my parents asked me to do. But then the issue is when you are conditioned early on, you don't self-learn early on. So you kind of miss that out. And so if you don't self-learn, in other words, you don't really discover more about who you truly are, if that makes sense, like from a more psychological perspective, your true self. And so a lot of people, when they go through this journey, right, going through the pilot academy, going to the training hours, you're very often by yourself. And so then when you go through that learning curve, then suddenly the conditional learning disappears, because logically speaking, right, if you go through a pilot academy or if you're training for something, society and your friends and your family, suddenly their opinions don't matter. And that's mainly because, again, logically speaking, you're going through that stuff alone. I mean, your parents are not with you inside the pilot training. They're not inside with you within the test flight. And so in other words, you spend a lot of time alone. And so when you spend a lot of time alone, you basically reflect on a lot of decisions. And so throughout this entire reflection mechanism, let me just write that there, reflection mechanism, you kind of like uncover, or in other words, discover more about yourself. And so honestly, that is the scary part, because discovering about yourself is, something very uncomfortable. And it takes quite a while for a lot of people, sometimes quicker or sometimes longer, depending on who you are and how much you let yourself to be discovered, if that makes sense. But a lot of people find out that when they actually discover about themselves, they tend to have different projections of who they want to be in life. And so for a lot of people, like, it's a shock, because they're like, hang on, my parents asked me to become this specific person, and I've honestly tilt towards a different type of person. And honestly, there are other factors like, family rejection. You don't want, to make your parents worried, or, you essentially want to make your parents proud. And if you don't do what they ask you to do, you'll probably like not hit their expectation or whatsoever. And there are, again, other reasons or factors that will discourage you to discover more about yourself and essentially become the person that you want to be, right? And that's the basic theological argument for this YouTube video. That's the basic argument I want you guys to understand. And so the issue with modern society is that a lot of young people, they tend to discover themselves a little bit too late. And again, age is not a specific indicator of when you discover yourself. People discover themselves when they're 30, when they're 18, when they're 20, when they're 40. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you have to kind of uncover and dig more about yourself, of who you really want to be. And so for a lot of people, that's quite an uncomfortable and unsettling journey. And honestly, I can relate, because I'm literally going through like these phases many, many times. But I promise you that once you learn and uncover more about yourself, you kind of like shape and have this concrete idea of who you want to be about, roughly. And so that is a good thing, and that will avoid the total chaos of you having a midlife crisis in the future. So at least that's the one plus point of figuring out what you want very early on. And so with that being said, at least for this specific point, I want you to understand that becoming who you want to be is highly correlated of discovering and understanding who you are as a person, right? And so very early on, you shouldn't become the person based on what people and society tells you, but instead become the person by identifying like who you literally are, like in a deeper way. And so that's the first principle. And now the second principle I want you guys to understand, because this is what I have literally experienced firsthand. And I'll give you a very specific example, right? Like, I wanted to become a professional football player, right? And that was probably for me like throughout childhood and throughout high school and even university, that was always for me like the end goal, right? Because I thought, and it is a great occupation, right? I mean, there's like 100 benefits that comes with it, obviously. And so the thing is, even if I wanted to, the reality was I didn't, right? Although I did to some extent, I became a professional footballer, but specifically like my goals, I wanted to play Champions League or I wanted to play for the national team. And to some extent, I did fulfill this dream. But then among my entire journey, I literally end up not doing this thing, right? And for me, like in the beginning, it was a huge shock. But I promise you probably experienced the same shit. Like you probably realize, hang on, like something doesn't make sense. And so I'll tell you why it is. Because throughout your journey, it's never the situation that it's linear, right? It's never the situation that's literally in a straight line. Very often your journey, like if we put it in a graph, it looks something like this, right? Like something like this, so exponential or however you want to call this, to be honest. And let's say this is your objective, right? Let's say that they share the same thing, right? And I'll tell you exactly what I'm trying to explain here. So if you want to be a professional footballer, right, then you're trying to like discover, okay, what are the stuff that makes you a good professional footballer, right? And I'm not only talking about like your skills like passing, shooting and crossing and headering and whatsoever. I'm talking about other stuff even off the field. Let's say like personal branding, your social media presence, and I don't know, your relationship and your network and your Instagram and your TikTok accounts. And so what happens is along this entire journey, you learn these specific sets of skills during your extreme times. And let me repeat that. So throughout this entire journey of you aiming for this, you will learn a specific set of skills or knowledge throughout these extreme phases. And why they happen through these extreme phases is because during the times of extreme phases, these are when you feel the most amount of pain, right? And so for a lot of people, they're like, oh, you know what? I want to avoid pain. I don't think pain is a good thing. But to be honest, pain is what makes you grow. Like that's actually the most cliche argument. But I'll explain to you why that kind of makes sense. Because firstly, when you are moments of your lowest and when you are moments of pain, then you become highly self-aware and conscious, like super conscious of what you want to do. And so when you are absolutely conscious, then you get all these crazy ideas of, I don't know, acquiring a new skill or learning something new. And obviously, unless, you fall down this tyrannical rabbit hole where you just, like self-destruct and you just make yourself worse or, become an alcoholic or start taking drugs. Now, obviously, that's not the right solution. But as a general rule, for a lot of people who go through pain, you learn something. You learn something specific, right? And so, again, they happen like during the extreme times, like especially extreme times of happiness and extreme times of like down or like pain and suffering. And so what happens is when you collect these specific skills and knowledge that happens through the extreme, just imagine for a moment, right? So let's say this is 1, 2, 3, and 4. Obviously, it'll probably be 100 if we put on a realistic graph. And so the person you will become is essentially, let's talk about maths here, is the 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 and all the other knowledge and stuff you have acquired. And the solution, right, if you add of all these together, the solution here is who you essentially become. And for the most case, is not this. Very often it's not this, because suddenly like all these random skills and all these random knowledges that you have acquired, you realize that you can utilize the sum of all these for something different. And if not something better, or something that suddenly aligns to your interest, to your passion. And so that's what I realized. I never knew that I would never go down this path. I thought this was the end goal for me. But then when I went through all of these phases of extreme happiness, pain and suffering, I acquired skills that I realized, hang on, like this is not what I'm passionate about. And so throughout time, all these different skills that I basically collected, I compiled them together made a simple like mathematical solution, if that makes sense. And I realized, you know what, this is the person I want to become, right? And specifically, it's a combination of cybersecurity, entrepreneurship, personal branding, doing sports, doing YouTube videos. It's like a whole sorts of things, and this sum is not static. It's fluid. I don't know if you guys can see this. Let me just double check. Yeah, you can. So this is fluid. It's actually not static. And so then you realize the more extremes you collect, the bigger the number gets. And in other words, the bigger the sum of the numbers get, the bigger your flipping North Star is. Like quite literally, the bigger your goal and the bigger the person you become. And essentially, if you become that transformer, let's say you become Optimus Prime, you become Optimus Prime, then you can do all sorts of stuff. And becoming a millionaire or professional footballer and actor won't even be in that horizon of yours anymore. Then you want to become like, I don't know, something much better. Just imagine this is a star. And so with that being said, like, don't worry too much about your future. Don't worry, and I have literally the same thing. I keep telling myself this every day. And don't be like too specific about it. Like, okay, you know what, I have to be this, and this is my specific route, and this is my plan. Like, because I have the issue, I plan literally my whole life, like the next 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. I plan it like specifically, you know, which routes, which education systems, which certificates, which companies I work for. Like, for some reason, like I have to have that in my mind. But I kind of like learn throughout this entire theory that that's very often not the case. And so I won't talk too religious about this, but that's why a lot of people say that, okay, you know what, your journey is written, or, you know, there's a different cause for your journey, or everything happens for a reason. And this is basically why. This is basically why that happens. And so don't worry if you're unsure about your future, if you're, you know, like, can't uncover it, or you're struggling, or you go through some pain and suffering. Do understand that when you go through these time of extremes, you're essentially learning, and it's contributing to something good, right? And so the more you learn, the bigger your sum becomes, and the bigger your sum becomes, the bigger of a person you get. Like, not literally like bigger, but metaphorically speaking, like your success, your legacy, your career. And so just understand this theory for a moment. I try to explain it as simple as I could. But with that being said,